of trade deficit, absurd practices in the City of London. I mean, you've had one of the greatest credit bubbles in the history of the world. And it was focused in two places, New York and London. And London had probably a bigger share proportionally than even New York. You can't just recover from a period like that in 6 months or a year and say, you know, we had a bad time, but now everything is okay. Come on, you had the worst credit bubble in the history of the world.
Why did Britain have the worst credit bubble in the world?
Because a lot of people moved from New York to the UK to get involved because some laws changed or some regulations changed. The UK is right language, right time zone, lots of reasons to go there. And so a lot of the business left the U.S. That's why the City of London, that's one of the reasons the City of London boomed. I mean, you were there, you saw what was going on. It was staggering, the amounts of money that people were taking out of some of those companies. That's why it boomed. And now, of course, in my view, you have to pay the piper. Some of the British politicians are like American politicians. They want to say, we shouldn't have to suffer. We're not going to let people suffer. We're going to make sure everything is okay. We're going to stop the depression. There's a good chance they're going to make the situation worse rather than better.
You use that phrase, the emperor has no clothes. What are you talking about in relation to Britain?
What, you said, why did it happen? And I'm saying, because, you know, you can walk down the street and say, Britain is great. Forget the balance of trade deficit. Forget the fact that we're building up gigantic debts. Don't worry. Well, somebody's going to say, wait a minute, I'm worried. You know, and once one person starts worrying, then another one, and another one, and another one, and the next thing you know, everybody says, hey, there's a problem here.
How does this work? Just take me through the stages of how this starts to fall over in practice. Okay, so for America and Britain, borrowing more to try and stimulate the economy, that fails. Then do people stop lending to them? I mean, how does it work?
Of course. I mean, you don't remember, but in the 70s, the UK went bankrupt. They had to be bailed out by the IMF. The British government at one time in the 1970s could not sell government bonds. I mean, this is staggering. The concept that the UK, which was the richest country in the world in 1918, say, couldn't sell government bonds. And that's what happens. People say, I'm not going to lend money to you anymore.
But that's not going to happen again.
Well, you write it down, okay? I would suspect you're going to find out that there will be a time in the foreseeable future. Nobody will lend money to Iceland right now. Nobody will lend money to other countries right now. I'm not saying that Britain is like Iceland at the moment. But if things do continue to deteriorate downward, there will come a time when people say, I'm not going to lend money to the UK anymore. I'm not going to lend money even to the US. People are already starting to question whether they should lend money to the US.
I guess so much of the model of the Anglo-American. So here's the thing. Okay, you count yourself as a free marketeer.
Yes.
You believe in markets. You believe in free trade. You believe in the Anglo-Saxon deregulated model, but you seem to be saying that it doesn't work and it's failed.
No, you know what really went wrong was they wouldn't let the model work. They wouldn't let the market work. In 1998, for instance, there was a huge company called Long-Term Capital Management, but not to bore you, but it failed. The central bank in America came to their rescue. Rather than letting them fail, which would have wiped out a lot of people, they propped them up. Now, had they let Long-Term Capital Management go bankrupt, we wouldn't have these problems today. Lehman Brothers would still be in business. Bear Stearns would still be in business because everybody would have been so whacked and hurt so badly, and a lot of people would have been fired. A lot of the morons had turned into the money makers. We wouldn't have these problems right now. The problem, and then again in 2001, things started collapsing. The central bank in America would not let people fail. They jumped in and said, we have to save everybody. And so then that led to a consumption bubble and a housing bubble. Had they let the market work, I promise you, we wouldn't have these problems right now. We would have had pain in 1998. We would have had pain in 2001. But the pain that we're having now and that we're going to have over the next few years is a lot worse than the pain we would have had they let the market work. Let's look at the UK. I know you're going to edit this. Let's look at the UK. Northern Rock started going bankrupt. Everybody started taking their money out and rushed over to Barclays and Royal Bank of Scotland and other people. Government stepped in its genius, bailed out Northern Rock to save, say, 100,000 people. So then everybody took their money out of Barclays and Royal Bank of Scotland and put it into Northern Rock. So then these banks were weakened. And so what you have is you weaken the whole system rather than let Northern Rock go bankrupt. Let's take that pain. That's 100,000 people, 200, whatever the number is. Take that pain. And then, okay, then you start over. But now they've weakened the whole system. The British government keeps pouring more and more and more money into everybody's rat hole. And the whole system gets weaker and weaker and weaker.
They would argue that they did wipe out the shareholders. The shareholders got totally wiped out. You can't expect to wipe out people who are just putting their savings in a bank account, a deposit
Well, no,
account.
I'm not in favor of that, but lots of bondholders could have been wiped out, lots of debtors could have been wiped out, and perhaps even if it came to it, some of the depositors, yes, I promise you, had the depositors lost some money, it would have sent a huge signal to everybody. Be careful of your banks. Don't just assume that all banks are safe just because they've been on the corner for 50 years. It would have made people a lot more alert. Just as if America had let long-term capital management go bankrupt, a lot more people would have been alert and been paying attention. You said before, but they keep saying it didn't matter. All these problems didn't matter. Well, fine. Eventually, when they do matter, people will be alert. Unfortunately, people ignored the lessons of history for a long time.
Just to clarify something, I mean, you said you fear that we're heading for a world depression, or is it the Western countries that particularly might suffer a depression?
Well, if the United States goes into serious recession or depression, that means Europe too. And if you have the two largest economies in the world, Europe and the U.S., in serious trouble, that means everybody's affected. I mean, some people will not be affected. Farmers will not be affected. Farming is going to be one of the best industries in the world in the next decade or two. But anybody who deals with Walmart, which is a large American retailer, is going to know that there are problems. The port of Singapore, the most efficient port in Asia, is going to be affected. If people are not trading, then everybody's going to be affected.
Do you think that Asia, just want to talk specifically about but China has been funding America's borrowing through buying treasuries. That has been a sort of fundamental axis of world economics for nearly a decade now. Is that going to sustain?
Well, it's not just China. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, a lot of countries in Asia, Asian countries have been doing it. There's no question about that. Is that going to continue? No. And in my view, no, not at all, because ultimately China will own all the U.S. government bonds if they keep going, or Japan will. So they have to cut back. They're already running into internal pressures themselves to do other things with the money and or to stop. I mean, they're the largest holder of U.S. government bonds ever. It's the first time in history that an undeveloped nation is financing a developed nation. The British for many decades went around and financed a lot of developing nations. You were a huge developed and world power, and you financed a lot of undeveloped nations. This is the first time in world history that the undeveloped nations are financing the developed nations, and that's because the developed nations are now in serious trouble, whether they recognize it or not. I am telling you, let's meet again in 5 years, and you will see that these guys are in serious trouble.
Gordon Brown was quite critical of what you said. You're saying that he's in denial.
Of course he's in denial. I mean, I will quote Mr. Brown himself. He said, a weak currency is a sign of a weak economy, which is a sign of a weak government. I didn't say that. Gordon Brown said that. Again, I have no position in sterling. I have no position at all in the UK. But Mr. Brown better wake up and realize that the balance of trade is getting worse. The debts are getting gigantic, the foreign debts, as well as the internal debts.
Doesn't having a weak currency and inflating things away make ultimate sense then?
Well, throughout history, many people have tried it, including the British. It has never worked in the long term. It has never worked in the medium term. Sometimes it's worked in the short term, that you can debase your currency and then have a competitive advantage and therefore do better. But debasing your currency, I don't think you can never show me any example in the history of the world, and I'm talking about thousands of years, where that's been a viable solution.
China's done that? China's debased its currency for the past 5 years?
No. China has made its currency stronger
Okay.
in the past few years.
Past
No,
few
no,
years, yeah.
quite the
Before
contrary.
that, before that, then, before.
Oh, they're under the communists. Yes, and well, you saw what kind of economy there was.